Here I briefly want to look at 7 chatbot design considerations for the African context. But it's not only for the African context, it's for any context where your users or most of your users do not interact with the chatbot in their first language. So there's 6 to 7 specific design considerations to keep in mind when people interact with your chatbot, but it's actually their second language. And I'll have some focus also on how easy it is to solve some of these problems making use of Rasa. The first thing just to mention is on the right, you will see the pipeline. That's a good starting point for if you want to train a chatbot in Rasa in a specific language. On the left, you can see at the bottom, there's a URL that explains the different pipeline components. And the longer URL is the byte pair featureizer with very lightweight embeddings of different languages, minor languages, which can be used to develop and train a chatbot in a specific language. First of all, there are languages, vernacular, and user context that's specific to certain regions, and that needs to be kept front of mind. So in Southern Africa, there's at least 35 indigenous languages. Vernacular is also very prevalent where people speak in a certain way in a certain area. And obviously, there are 9 to 11 dominant languages. And the problem here is that cloud solutions um, have got a limited and very closed language offering due to obviously development and investment constraints. So you find that most chatbots in regions like Southern Africa, where are deployed in English, but the users' first languages are not English. So the first thing is to, after you've rolled out your chatbot in English, is to try and develop a conversational experience in vernacular. The second thing is to keep in mind in lesser developed areas is the preferred mediums. So we found that SMS text is still very dominant in terms of users' preferred mediums to interact with the chatbot. Then WhatsApp it's got a fair presence and obviously web and app. So this dominance of SMS and text, SMS text, is driven by the fact that users have older phones or older handsets, which cannot accommodate messaging applications. And the second thing to keep in mind is if you deal with SMS and text, there's a lack of conversational components. So you don't have the luxury of buttons and or marquees or web views like you would in something like Facebook Messenger or in an app or a web environment. The third thing is obviously affordances, conversational affordances, and it almost makes it easier to step into voice, seeing that you don't have this impediment of affordances in the conversational experience. And the fourth thing is delivery and message synchronization. So with SMS, it's not always ensured that delivery will take place, and if the chatbot sends multiple messages, they lose sync, and that's confusing for the user. The third thing to keep in mind is design and desire. So I like this analogy. When a park is designed, there's a design path, but then there's a path of desire, the path the users want to take. And so design and desire does not always overlap, and that delta can be quite big. So obviously the ideal is to have the design path and the desire path of the conversation exactly in sync. So just some things to keep in mind. In South Africa, unemployment is more than 32%, and youth unemployment is over 60%. So something we found in developing a chatbot for one of the larger pizza franchise was that the number one intent was jobs, users, people looking for employment. And there was something not catered for. The second thing was sponsorships, schools, organizations, institutions, sports clubs looking for sponsorships. Um, and those were intents and conversations the users wanted to have, which we had to incorporate into the conversation. So I think quite often there's a design which is based on products and services and the offering of the organization, but then there's also desire, the conversation that the user wants to have. Just carrying on in that theme, this is a Venn diagram I saw first with Vincent Warmerdam from Rasa, where he just indicated um, the the conversation that should be developed in this overlap in this Venn diagram. So on the left you have what the users say. On the right you've got what is designed and developed, what you believe the user might say. And in the overlap, that's where the magic happens. That's where the conversations take place. So everything um, on the left here, with these are all conversations the user want to have, which is not addressed. And on the right here, this portion um, is development that's done that's also not being used by the user. And obviously, we want to grow this portion in the middle as much as possible. And later on, I'll just briefly look at CDD with Rasa X, but it's really a very nifty way to grow this overlap and hence build your organization's competitive advantage. I also like this graph in terms of where you look at effort over time. So with mobile apps, there's an initial steep effort of getting the app out, but effort quickly drops as time goes on, and the app is established. So this is a lure when it comes to chatbots, that there's not that much effort, and a chatbot can very easily and quickly be rolled out to users. And as it's being used, you'll find that there's a huge ramp up in effort to make the chatbot more effective. And this is in this area, that's where Rasa X really comes into its own, by climbing this steep incline and putting in the effort to improve the chatbot. So on the left there, you can see the Rasa X console, where you can, on a daily basis, have an NLU inbox and improve your chatbot's conversation. So when it comes to chatbot improvement, you really want three elements. You want it to be continuous, you want it to be incremental and contextual as well. And that's something you can do with CDD and with Rasa X. And most NLU environments have existing tools for conversational improvement, but these tools are often very high level. It's got a statistical approach, it's bulk, metrics focused, and it's really hard to steer. And you have a situation where you regularly oversteer and understeer on intents. The fourth thing to keep in mind is that users speak in compound intents and entities. So if you present a user with an interface with buttons or a carousel, then you're actually forcing them to structure their input. And that takes away the lure or the advantage of a conversational input, a conversational interface where you can really just have unstructured input. So we found that about 4% of users select a menu option when presented with a menu, and 96% of users opt to give their input unstructured in one or two sentences. One of the reasons for this, I believe, is that users do not have the ability, seeing they are conversing in a second or a third or perhaps even a fourth language, being English, they do not know how to structure or categorize their query. based on the menu they're presented with. So they feel more comfortable by expressing themselves in natural language. And the ideal is for the chatbot to take that unstructured input, to structure it, to extract the compound intents and entities, and then also unstructure the data at the end and speak back to the user in a very natural, unstructured, conversational way. The fourth thing to keep in mind is disambiguation. So there are instances where it's virtually impossible for a chatbot to disambiguate, but for us as humans, that's quite easy. So I like this first example where I say a drop of water on my mobile phone, or I drop my mobile phone in the water. So for a chatbot, for any conversational interface, to disambiguate those two sentences is quite hard. But for us as humans, that's quite easy. If we look at the second example, I saw my friend Alex with binoculars. That's ambiguous for humans and for machines. So as a human, we don't know, does this mean I saw Alex carrying a pair of binoculars, or could I only see Alex by using a pair of binoculars? And on the right here is just the example of how IBM Watson assistant approaches this, where I give a ambiguous input, tell me more about loans, and because of the ambiguity, IBM Watson Assistant presents a disambiguation menu where it says, did you mean get a loan, pay a loan, apply for credit, or none of the above? So whenever there's ambiguity, the best is not to jump to conclusions, but allow the user to disambiguate with a short disambiguation menu. The sixth thing to keep in mind is domain and irrelevance. So obviously when a chatbot is developed, it's for a very specific domain, a very specific use. So obviously there will be in-domain and out-of-domain inputs. And again, here is an example from Watson Assistant where you can mark an input as irrelevant. Um, so if a chatbot can clearly distinguish what is in-domain and out-of-domain, it can advise the user accordingly. The seventh thing to keep in mind is digression. So digression is part of human conversation. We digress all the time. And if you look at the example on the right there, you will see that the user is filling out a form, making an appointment, and when the user is prompted for what time the appointment should be made, the user wants to know about what time does the organization or the company closes. So that's a natural digression. The user wants to know the hours before committing to a time. So in this example, the chatbot allows digression where it answers the question, we close it at 6 p.m., but then it goes back to what time will suit you. If a chatbot does not do that and it keeps on falling back to give me the time, that's something called fallback proliferation. So with digression, we can avoid fallback proliferation, and we also can have truly unstructured conversational experience as well. Um, the most chatbots go to two extremes. So either they don't allow digression, or they do allow digression, but they lose the context of the conversation the user was in, and the user needs to re-enter all the information again. So that balance is needed. So in summary, the 7 points. First one, try and develop for language, vernacular, and user context. While doing that, number two, look at preferred mediums. Number three, design and desire should align. Number four, cater for compound intents and entities. Number five, disambiguation is really important. Number six, domain and irrelevance. And number seven, make provision for digression. And just lastly, on the Rasa benefits. So when I mentioned CDD and Rasa X, so Rasa X is the tool through which the practice of conversation-driven development can be executed. So there's quite a bit of information on CDD, but it's a very good approach of developing the dialogue via the user's conversations. And again, also with Rasa, they have this uncanny ability to surface complexity in a very simplified fashion. So you don't need to be a data scientist to to build and train your own chatbot. I think a third thing that's very clever about the architecture is that the pipeline is independent from your training data. So you can have your training data, you can change and update your pipeline, you can train and retrain and test the results. The last thing to mention, which is not listed here, is that with Rasa, Rasa Core is a separate entity from Rasa NLU. So if you do develop a chatbot in a specific language or a vernacular, then you can make the NLU portion available via an API to different areas within your organization, and they can leverage that development made in the NLU space.